are being distributed. See that they fit tightly behind the hills. Get to cover. Get under cover at once. The enemy are not in any great force, but our anti-aircraft gunners will speedily dispose of them.
The 1936 film of H.G. Wells' Things to Come. A vision of what modern warfare would bring. Air raids, gigantic and immediate. Large cities destroyed overnight, thousands of aircraft, millions of dead, complete disaster. A vision in the 1930s that grew into a nightmare. Another war would mean the end of civilization. September the 1st, 1939.
This is the national program from London. The first news, copyright reserved. These are today's main events. Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns. Parliament was summoned for 6 o'clock this evening. Orders completing the mobilization of the Navy, Army and Air Force was signed by the King at a meeting this afternoon of the Privy Council. The British Cabinet met from 11:30 this morning until 1:30, and both Houses of Parliament were summoned for 6 o'clock this evening. President Roosevelt has appealed to the European powers that if they should be involved in hostilities, they should refrain from bombing civilians and unfortified towns.
The nightmare was about to become real. War with Germany seemed unavoidable. But surprisingly, London was the best prepared city in Europe. Surprisingly, because most people, though apprehensive, refused to concern themselves personally with preparations for war. Throughout the 30s, men like Shaw, Wells, Attlee and Churchill had warned the public of the horrors of war and the danger of Germany. But the public had ridiculed civil defense, supported appeasement. Yet quietly, the government had laid its plans in case the Holocaust should come. Now in the crisis, they were ready, with millions of shrouds and extra hospital beds, gas masks for the entire population, extra police for the rioting crowds expected to cram roads and railways as soon as the bombing began. On the very first day of the crisis, a huge evacuation scheme went into action.
The evacuation of British children is going on smoothly and efficiently. The Ministry of Health says that great progress has been made with the first part of the government's arrangement.
It was crowds of children. We went from Stafford Road. It was terrible. Mothers crying and children crying. But we couldn't go with them. Once we left them outside like this place, we had to go away and leave them then. They never know, didn't know where they was going to or who they were going with.
I mean, you felt ever so sorry for the children. And the children didn't seem to realise actually what was happening to them. And we had to try to cheer them up the best way we could. Because their mothers and fathers, they wanted their mothers and crying.
In 3 days, 600,000 children were evacuated. On Sunday, September the 3rd, London waited for the last seconds of Britain's ultimatum to Germany to tick away. At 11:15, Chamberlain spoke to the nation.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Within seconds, the sirens sound. This is it. Suddenly, no one really knows what to do. Or everyone does. Wardens run down the streets giving conflicting orders. Cars are stopped, people are hurried to shelters, gas rattles are sounded. For a few brief moments, confusion reigns. They are coming quicker even than anyone expected. It was a false alarm. Officially, a Home Office misunderstanding. Someone, it seemed, had decided to test all the sirens, but had not got round to warning everybody else that it was going to happen. It was, in some ways, an apt start. That night, the pubs were packed. The joviality had a frantic quality about it. Drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But nothing happened. Preparations continued, but the bombs didn't come.
Things are not going a bit like we imagined they would, are they? I was led to expect that thousands of bombers would be overhead the first day war was declared, that we'd all be gassed and blown to pieces right away. Funny, you know. Here we are at war, yet everything's going on just the same. It all seems unreal, doesn't it?
Of course, things were not going on just the same, really. The authorities made enormous efforts to use the breathing space to bring London to a full state of readiness. Advertisers did not take long to see how things could be turned to good advantage.
Me and my girl, meant for each other, sent for each other, and liking it so. Me and my girl, no use pretending, we knew the ending some ages ago. Some little church with a big steeple, just a few people that both of us know, and we'll have love, laughter, be happy ever after, me and my girl.
The mood of the advertisers was repeated in the newsreels, where natty ideas showed you how to get around in the blackout. But the natty tips had their serious sides. Throughout the hours of darkness, no light must be visible outside, which meant everybody had to curtain their windows so that not the slightest chink of light got through. And there were air raid wardens on hand to see that the rule was obeyed. The theories seemed to be that thus the enemy bombers would be unable to find London in the dark. As a result, by December 1939, there were 40 pedestrian deaths in London's streets each day.
Oh, sweet mystery of love and life.
By 1940, the fire service had become popularly known as the Darts Team. Air raid wardens were thought officious and unnecessary, and people got angry with the government for frightening them all in the first place.
In fact, the warden service itself was getting rather fed up with the whole thing. They were wishing they could have the bombs so that people could realize that we weren't just taking them on, you see.
Johnny, have you got everything on board you ought to have?
Yes, I think so, Will.
Well, thank goodness, that's something anyway.
I would like to stroll upon the prom, with the brass band playing tiddly hom.
Are you the fire brigade?
Fire brigade? Not all of it, no, there's some more in the yard. Why, what's the matter?
Quick, do come along, there's a house on fire.
Rob Wilton was funny, particularly because people didn't think he was far wrong.
What address is it?
Grimshaw Street.
Grimshaw Street, Now, wait a minute, I know it as well as can be, and I can't just place it.
Oh, come along, it's only just down there.
No, don't tell me. Let me think of it for myself. Grimshaw. Oh, isn't that annoying? I could walk straight to it, and I can't think of it.
It's next to Whiteley Street.
Next to Whiteley. Oh, I know it as well as can be, Grimshaw. What's the number, lady? What number is it?
78.
78. Turned out nice again today, hasn't it?
Here is a short news bulletin. The German army invaded Holland and Belgium early this morning by land and by landings from parachutes. The necessary measures for giving assistance were put into effect at once.
On May the 10th, 1940, Hitler suddenly attacked Holland and Belgium without warning and crashed through their feeble defenses.
In the light of this morning's events in Holland and Belgium, householders are recommended to overhaul their domestic preparations against the possibility of air attack in their own districts. It is emphasized that tube stations in London are not available as air raid shelters.
The situation rapidly deteriorated into disaster. The French and British armies were driven back. After only 3 weeks fighting, the British were improvising a hurried escape across the Channel from Dunkirk, while France was on the verge of total collapse. In London, with the German army only a few miles away across the Channel, Churchill, now Prime Minister, broadcasts to the nation.
Should the invader come to Britain, there will be no placid lying down of the people in submission before him, as we have seen, alas, in other countries. We shall defend every village, every town, and every city. The vast mass of London itself, fought street by street, could easily devour an entire hostile army, and we would rather see London laid in ruins and ashes than that it should be tamely and abjectly enslaved.
Invasion was expected at any moment. Fire watchers looked up for parachutists, not down for fires. Parks and open spaces were littered with trenches and obstacles to prevent the landing of enemy planes and gliders. And in the distance, the Battle of Britain raged. Throughout August 1940, the vapor trails could be seen and the distant sounds of dogfights heard as the battle reached a climax over southern England. But London was still untouched. Then came Saturday, September the 7th, 1940. 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
They came over Hackney Marshes, a squadron of them, and then turned southwards towards the river. I thought, well, this is it.
"320 bombers and 600 fighters overhead. 300 tons of bombs concentrated on Silvertown and the dockland area of West Ham, a borough that had been contemptuous of civil defence only 9 months before. The terraced houses collapsed like packs of cards. The sun was blacked out by smoke. Chaos and confusion reigned as the fires seemed to burn out of control. Two hours later, the all clear sounded. The people were dazed and confused. The authorities seemed powerless. And now, people started to run. They collected together what belongings they could and got out. Entire families escaping westwards. Hand carts, prams, bicycles piled with pots, pans, bedding, valuables. That evening, the fires were still blazing. The sky was red. The sun seemed to set in the east as well as the west. And the enemy bombers had a beacon to guide them to the target. From 8 in the evening till 4 the next morning, 250 bombers were overhead. In some places, the long-trained civil defense worked well. In others, it didn't exist or couldn't cope. In the darkness, terror was added to chaos in the narrow streets by the river. Morning revealed the full extent of the devastation. 1,000 Londoners had been killed. No enemy planes had been shot down. Whole tracts of the East End had been reduced to rubble. People were a complex of emotions, of sorrow, of anger, of hopelessness and despair. Rumors spread that West Ham was ready to surrender. The authorities, where they had prepared at all, had prepared for the wrong things. There were millions of shrouds, but no homes for the homeless. There were thousands of empty hospital beds, but no adequate provisions for treating shock and minor injuries. It had been anticipated that one bombed house would mean 4 dead people. The government had organized accordingly. On the morning of September the 8th, 1940, there were 1,000 dead, but there were many more thousands of the awkwardly dazed homeless, alive but with nowhere to go. Schools were opened as rest centres. They were neither suitable nor prepared, but they were the only places big enough. Very soon, 25,000 people were living in them.
Can I have your name?
Albert Vickery.
Albert Vickery. Is this your wife?
Yes.
And what's happened to your house?
My home's been bombed out, you see, and I want to take my wife and children down the country to my sister's.
Last night, lady, my house was bombed.
Yes.
And all the things were gone. And I didn't know what to do.
That morning, and in the days that followed, as people improvised and helped each other, and as the organizations that existed struggled valiantly with problems often quite beyond them, fear began to turn to anger. The East End started to think about how to get something done.
It was those of us who had a realization, however faint, that the worst was yet to come. We made the noise. We harassed the local authorities.
You wanted to be safe, you didn't know what to do.
I said, if something is not done, I will lead the people to Whitehall.
Oh, Miss Ellen Wilkinson went down to the very early shelters, where I don't remember now, but somewhere south of the river. And she said, this place is terribly damp and my water's all over my feet. Walking in, this was. Something ought to be done about this. And the man in charge of that isn't water, that's urine. They were as bad as that.
Churchill came down. It was not an extensive visit, but he came down and visited the scene of devastation, and his comment was that he could not understand the threat of the people to march on Whitehall. There seemed to be less disorder amongst the people than there was amongst the authorities.
Churchill knew the Germans were trying to make the city uninhabitable and break the spirit of the people. He could defy Hitler, but hardly the population of London as well. 100 miles away on the other side of the Channel, Goering hoped to win the war at one glorious stroke. London was to collapse under a weight of bombing no city had experienced before. He would avenge the few feeble but provocative attacks Churchill had ordered the RAF to make on Berlin. But in bombing London, the Luftwaffe turned away from attacking the vital RAF fighter fields in southern England. Had they known it, in those attacks they'd almost crippled fighter command. But now the RAF was reprieved and was soon shooting the Luftwaffe out of the sky in ever-increasing numbers. In a bid for personal glory, some German pilots flew off course to bomb Buckingham Palace. They failed to kill the king, but succeeded in uniting London in a way the government might never have done. Britain may not have had a ministry of propaganda, but somehow such opportunities for cashing in on popular sentiment were never missed.
The king is still in London, in London, in London, and he would be in London town if London Bridge was falling down. He's got a house in London, in London, in London, and there within the palace yard the soldiers of the king stand guard. Strike up the music, roll up the drums, and let all the trumpets play. Tell all the world we're facing the music. Here we all are, and here we all stay. The king is still in London, in London, in London. Like Mr. Jones and Mr. Brown, the king is still in town.
Every night the Germans came. The daylight was becoming too expensive for them. The routine was always the same. Inevitable drone, inevitable bombs, and nothing to fight back with. The fighter planes were no use at night. But then Churchill ordered up all the available Ack-Ack guns for the defense of London. On September the 12th, they opened fire. Churchill knew that this roaring cannonade could do little harm to the enemy. The gunners succeeded in shooting down a mere 4 planes, and the shrapnel from the shells probably killed more people on the ground than in the air. But it didn't matter. The psychological effect was terrific.
And I went into one shelter locally, and they said, oh, listen to that lovely music outside. There was that woman, I walking down the road one morning, and she'd had an Ack-Ack shell through her roof. And the neighbour came out and was sympathising with her and saying, well, no, dear, but 'tis a shame, and your nice house. And she was furious. She said, who are you sympathising with? That was one of our shells, that was.
The Blitz was settling down into a ritual. In the morning, new areas of destruction. Another street gone, another friend dead.
BBC Home Service, up in the morning early. This time, the physical exercises for ladies.
Regularity meant familiarity. Grin and bear it. Chin up, improvise.
Good morning, everyone. Will you get your chair and stand with your left side towards the back of it and your left hand on it? Now swing your right leg across in front of your left one so that it comes as high as you can get it. Both knees straight. Now let it swing down towards the floor and straight sideways. As high sideways as it will go. Swing it towards the floor and across in front of the left one, towards the floor and straight sideways. Now put it down. And let's try all that with the music, keeping both knees straight. Ready? Go. Swing in front, to the side, across, to the side. And across, to the side. And swing out, across, and up. And up, across, and stop.
The eerie silence of the deserted streets closed by an unexploded bomb. But the day does not stop. The normal life of the capital simply flows round it. By afternoon, people are queuing for the shelters again. They have trekked across London for a good place in a deep tube in the West End. It's become a routine, and that very dreary routine is important. It means people are learning how to deal with the situation, that they are coming to terms with what they have to face. Yet even now, more than half the people of London were sleeping at home and leaving the official air raid shelters, complete with the proper bunks and sanitation, almost empty. As the people settled down, they passed the time in ways they knew best. A common danger and a shared routine broke down barriers and made the Blitz, for many people, one of the best times of their lives.
What's your darling? Oh. Hello, Miss Fox. Hello, Miss. Good evening.
I think that'll be all right now.
Yes, that's grand.
Anyway, I'll be back in a few minutes if you want.
Now, how are we going to get you up there?
Oh,
London was an exciting place to be. Theatres and dance halls were open again. Young people felt the need for a good time. They worked hard, they played hard. For who knew how long it would last? And tomorrow you might be dead. Prostitutes stood under the business-as-usual signs, and people poured in at night to share the exhilaration of being in a city under fire. Everyone, authorities and volunteers, felt they were fighting not only against a common danger, but for an ideal. And by now they had learned how to cope, how to wait, and how to act when the time came.
Let us pray. O God, we commit ourselves into thy keeping this night. We pray thee to bless all those who are keeping us safe. For Christ's sake.
The defenses knew the pattern and went about tonight what they'd done last night, all over again. While the battle of fire and bombs raged outside, the battle of fear and courage went on inside. People sheltered where they felt safe. At the beginning, this was mainly in the basements of warehouses, under the railway arches, in makeshift sheds of their own. It was the familiarity and good company that made them feel safe. And it was here that they died. The government had been forced to open the tubes to shelter us, but the best place to be was in a big private shelter, like those under the Dorchester or the Savoy, where each guest had his own marked mattress and his meals served in bed. But the majority of the people, of course, couldn't go there. The breakdown of class barriers didn't extend that far. People from the East End even marched on the Savoy to demand admission. In the tubes, the trains not only woke you up, they began to bring you food. And throughout the night, welfare officers and the WVS brought tea and comfort to those who needed it. Blitz was the last great occasion when the middle classes were able to offer charity to the working class and be readily accepted. And they did it with a courage and enthusiasm that probably did as much to save London as the courage of the Cockneys themselves.
I can remember one particular shelter where we had a great deal of trouble, night after night. It was a sort of shelter where, if one child hit another child, out came a knife, you know, the sort of thing. And eventually, we solved it by finding someone who was head of a gang in that area. We knew that everyone was frightened of this gang, so we got the wife, who was a very big, sturdy woman, and she was made shelter warden, and we had no more trouble at all.
And on the platform, when you couldn't get inside the shelter, like the underground, you'd lay on the platform. I bet you didn't have no room to move at all. You couldn't walk round each other, you know. It's ever so crowded.
London people aren't awfully fond of ventilation, or they weren't in those days. And you would go down to the shelter, perhaps, as we very often did, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You'd find all the ventilators open, everything quite as it should be. And if you went down there at 1 o'clock in the morning, every ventilator would be stuffed up with rags, and you'd have to pull them all out again, because they liked a good fug. And they certainly got it in some of them.
Dirty people somewhere. You tried to get where the clean people were, you know, for your own safety for the kiddies, you know.
They were extraordinarily healthy. And that's just one of those acts of God, I am absolutely convinced. Because if ever there were conditions through which an epidemic could start, it was there. And yet it never did.
And in an extraordinary way, they didn't seem to know what was happening outside. On the most terrible night, when perhaps we'd had our canteen fall into a crater about 3 times that hadn't been there yesterday, and we'd had to lie on our faces so many times to try and get the food in at all. They wouldn't know anything about that. The curtains came down outside, and they didn't hear. So when you got inside, they didn't say, "It's a terrible night, isn't it, dear?" They sometimes said, "How's the raid going?" But mostly they were so far underground, rather like moles, you know.
Of course, they gave me a name which I must honestly say I simply loved, and it was Mother London, and I really did love it very much.
And they called me alternately Lady Phoebe, which was a kind of nightcap thing that you put over your hair at night, or even simply, which seemed a little bit irreverent, Our Lady.
London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights by an average of over 200 bombers. Altogether, 14,000 tons of high explosive hit the city, an average of 200 tons of high explosive bombs each night.
Some people I knew gave a lift to a couple in a car who'd lost their home, and they were taking them to relations in the country. And the man who was driving the car said to them, "Was it your own house?" And the woman said, no, the man said, "Yes." But the woman nudged him and said, "No, dear, would have been Monday." When you think of the instalments and instalments that they'd paid, but there they were, perfectly cheerful, driving away, and just said, "Would have been Monday."
And we walked through the tunnel from Liverpool Street to the Bank Station. And when I got there, I felt like turning back. There was nothing else but bodies. Well, it's hard to describe. It was just like tailor's dummies put up against the wall. Some with no clothes on, some with half their clothes on. And we had to tear the toilets, they were like plywood sheets with these sanitary pails inside. We had to tear them down to use them as stretchers.
The poor at the home, you'd think, and the more, remember the 1930s, before the war, had been heartbreaking for Deptford. I mean, long lines of unemployed. They'd got so little, you'd have thought. Yet when the time came, they had the courage of lions.
Well, it was like one big family during the Blitz. If you got bombed out, the person next door took you in, and that's how it went.
I rode home during the Blitz, and he was really going to town, old Jerry again. And when I opened the door and went in the passageway, I smelt the supper cooking. So I said to my missus, "God blimey, girl, why aren't you doing the shelter?" So she said, well, you have to work in it, you want feeding it. Now that's how the women were. Not all of them, mind you.
From November onwards, the bombing wasn't every night. It seemed like a breather. In any case, neither Hitler nor bombing was going to stop commerce and children making the best of Christmas. If you couldn't sell model aeroplanes for kids now, you never would. But there shouldn't have been any children in London to enjoy a Blitz Christmas. They should have been evacuated away from the danger. That they were not was not the authorities' fault. They'd been sent, but they'd drifted back. Families wanted to be together and hang the danger. There were 250,000 children in London for Christmas 1940. You can't force parents to let their children go. Loss of sleep was a major problem. Many people who did a full-time job in the day and a voluntary one at night went through much of the war on 3 or 4 hours sleep. Others paid for a good night's rest. There was no shortage of private firms ready and willing to cash in on the fears and exhaustion of their countrymen. For a few shillings, you could buy your peace in Epping Forest, join the already resident campers who spent the whole war there, or even spend the weekend in Torquay. It was preferable to paying a wide boy 6pence to keep you a place in the shelters.
The moon that lingered over London town, poor puzzled moon, he wore a frown.
A new phrase entered the vocabulary, bomber's moon. For the first time for centuries, the Londoner was as conscious of the weather as the countryman.
The streets of town were paved with stars. It was such a romantic affair. And as we kissed and said goodnight, a nightingale sang in Berkeley.
What's it like out, Jacko?
Smashing mood.
Ah, that'll be us then.
Yeah, all right.
On the 29th of December 1940, the city burnt down. It was the second Great Fire of London. As high winds spread the flames, the fire brigade needed 600,000 gallons of water a minute to fight 1,400 fires. But bombs shattered the water mains, and the Thames was at its lowest ebb of the whole year. The firemen's hoses ran dry and choked with mud. But the fires should never have happened. The raid was a comparatively small one, 136 aircraft and 3,000 incendiary bombs. But it was the Sunday after Christmas, and the fire watches were away. The offices and warehouses locked, so small fires were allowed to become big ones, and firemen couldn't get at them. Customs officers even prevented them from entering one blazing bonded warehouse because they did not have the necessary authorization. Surrounded by fire, the most vulnerable building of all still stood, St. Paul's, a symbol of defiance. It had been hit by dozens of firebombs, but had been saved by its own efficient fire team. The model was obvious, and Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, was soon on the radio to rub it in.
Some of you lately, in more cities than one, have failed your country. This must never happen again.
Fire watching was made compulsory. The government had believed that the British would resist the idea of compulsion, but no one complained. Instead, they just dodged it. 3/4 of those registered claimed exemption. In contrast, the bus drivers and conductors continued to operate their services, whatever the conditions. The homely red buses had become as much a symbol of London's survival and resistance as St. Paul's.
We crept all the way down till I got to Canning Town. I saw Charlie Madgwick, he was another inspector, see? So he said, well, what are you going to do? Now, are you going on? I said, yes, I'll go on. So we go to Woolwich. Ain't got a soul on board. I get to Woolwich, and in a few minutes, these people came out to stand a telephone, and they all got on the bus. And we didn't worry too much then about time schedules, as long as you was doing your job. So we came out, and I just got round the back station into the, what they call the Albert Road. And they caught him in the searchlights, and they really let him have it, and he let us have it and all. So I stopped the bus and I went back in, and I said, now, look, I said, if you people want to take shelter, you can. But if you want to go, I'm ready to take you. And I went upstairs, there was about a dozen up top. I said, no, don't sit up here, mate. I said, come on downstairs. And I said, I'll get you through if you can. And they all got inside, and away we went.
the public expected the bus to be there, if you understand what I mean. They came out of a morning to go to work and they expected the bus to be there. And it was always there. Well, 9 times out of 10, the bus was there.
By 1941, authorities and people had learned to live with the Blitz. Bombing did not disorganize life, nor air raid stop production. At the start, everything had come to a halt when the sirens had sounded, and the resulting disruption had often been more costly than the effects of the raid itself. Now, with spotters on the roof, factories carried on until the bombing got dangerously close.
Hello, gunfire in the southeast. Right.
And this didn't only apply to big organizations involved in war production, but to shops and ordinary people as well.
Sirens have sounded, but we are carrying on. Those who'd wish to do so may take shelter in the basement. Alarm bells will be rung if our roof spotters report that danger threatens, when all floors must be cleared at once. Carry on.
People had proved their adaptability in a remarkable way. Far from running mad in the streets as forecast, people seemed to be taking the bombardment in their stride. There was no increase in insanity, and the suicide rate actually dropped. After 6 months of almost continuous bombing, London was the opposite of the wasteland of twisted, smoking rubble, inhabited only by the last half-crazed survivors that so many wise men had forecast. It seemed healthier, more honest, happier even than ever before.
When the Blitz was on, life was very easy because you had only 2 things you were thinking about. Where do I get something to eat? Where do I sleep? And that does simplify life most marvelously.
When I got there, the woman in charge of the canteen I'd left for the night said to me, "Did you know there was a monkey found under a stone?" "A monkey?" I said. She said, "Yes." I said, "What do you do with it?" "Oh," she said, "seeing he was a shock case, we gave him a cup of hot tea with plenty of sugar." I said, "What happened to him then?" They said, "We took him across to the warden's post." Now, in the warden's post, a warden used to live in tin hat, you know. Not the sort of man who'd be in charge, just an ordinary man who could take things down. So I said to him, "Did you have a monkey brought into you?" He said, "Oh, him." And he took down a little brown file off a shelf. And on it was written, "Monkey." And in brackets underneath it, "Believe Jacko." Well, I said, "What did you do with him?" Well, he said, "Seeing he was a shock case, I roll him in a rug and lay him flat." And I think, oh, then he put his head in the air, and he said, because he always, when he was quoting anything, put his head in the air, and he said to me, "An animal was injured in an air raid belonged to the police." So I said, "Well, did you send for the police?" He said, "I did," and they come along and they take a look at him and say, maybe he'd fancy a drop of hot milk. So he goes back to the police station, and they brings a cup of hot milk, and the monkey gives himself a kind of shake as if to say, "That's better," takes the cup in his little hand, strains it to the bottom, and then he acts perfectly natural and turns round and bites the policeman. So then I said, "What happened to him next?" So then he had a look at his file, licking his finger and turning over the pages as if there was a lot of news, you know. And he said, "Oh, him, he's all right, he's got relations." I said, "What kind of relations has Jackie got?" He said, "He's got an auntie in the Midlands." So I said, of course, what really had happened was the poor unfortunate man who was killed had got an auntie in the Midlands, and I have an awful feeling that auntie was rung up and said, "Well, your nephew's dead and there's a monkey coming." Anyway, the next stage was, I said, has he gone to his auntie in the Midlands? And once more, up went the head. He said, "An animal was injured in an air raid has to see a vet before they can travel," which indeed was the law. And I said, "Well, has he seen a vet?" He said, "Well, we rang up the zoo, and they takes a look at him, and they says no. And they sent a little ambulance, and he's gone up there to rest and recuperate."
Well, girls, would you like to hear a nice bedtime story?
Oh, yes. What is a bedtime story?
Now, I'm glad you asked me that. Well, a bedtime story, Mr. Handler.
As Londoners tuned into Itmar, the air defences tuned into the German radio beams which guided the bombers onto their target. By May 1941, with night fighter radar and improved ground control, the RAF seemed to have won the night battle. But on May the 10th, the German navigation beams crossed over London.
Hello, OC speaking. Right. That was Home Office Fire Control. They'll be raiding tonight.
London's fire chief summoned 1,000 extra fire engines into the city from all over the country. In the fighter control rooms, the radar plots were showing hundreds of bombers converging on London. The controller scrambles his night fighters into the dark to meet it. Over the city, the first flares and firebombs start to fall.
OP control, 36 OP. Incendiary bombs falling between 145 degrees and 180 degrees, about 3/4 of a mile.
It is to be the classic pattern. First, mark the target and get some good fires going with incendiaries. Then spread the flames and hamper the firefighting with high explosives.
Control. Right. Fire at Dock Street, sub.
At fire control headquarters, they deploy their forces like a general fighting a tactical battle. Hospitals, factories, stations, communication centers are vital. Private houses are low on the priority list. But it's hard for ordinary people to see the battle like this. In Brixton, angry citizens blocked the path of engines racing past their burning homes to other fires. The engines have to force a way through by driving straight at the people.
It was light enough to read a newspaper. Street lamps wilted like grass, and paint ran down the walls in the intense heat.
The bomb that hit the underground shelter at the Elephant left shadows of humans imprinted on the walls like at Pompeii.
I said to myself, run, for Christ's sake, run.
The whole city, from Poplar in the east to Fulham in the west, north and south of the river, seemed like one continuous roaring fire. Victoria Street blazed from end to end. By midnight, 2,000 fires were out of control. The firemen available staggered by the size of the fire, quite unable to cope.
No. Sub, only 66 pumps available.
Right, get on to brigade control. Call still being received. Further help required. Pumps available, 66.
Despite the new regulations, warehouses and offices were locked, and scared fire watchers had panicked and allowed fires to get an early home.
Can you hear me? Checking your pumps available. 10 pumps, thank you. 10, thank you. 10 pumps available. Give me your pumps available, please. 66. New. 10. Thank you.
Come out of the float there!
By 2 a.m., the water pressure dropped. Over 600 mains had been smashed.
Johnny! She's finished!
There was nothing to be done.
Gutters were choked with idle pumps, coils of empty hose. Firemen huddled in cold, dispirited groups doing nothing, or hung onto hoses whose nozzles only dribbled water like tea spouting from a pot.
(1,436 dead. 2,000 seriously injured. 14 enemy planes shot down. A riot at the Elephant and Castle as the canteens brought breakfast to the exhausted firefighters. £20 million worth of damage. 8,000 streets impassable, 1/3 of London. 5,500 houses demolished. 12,000 homeless. 700 acres completely consumed by fire. And the German radio asking,
Do you want any more refreshments, Mr. Churchill?
Sunday morning, and the city fills with sightseers. While some people queue for death certificates, others plunder the damaged shops and pubs. 150,000 families without water, gas or electricity. Half the main telephone system destroyed. 2 more nights like that and London will be knocked right out. The House of Commons completely gutted. And in the night, firemen had complained that the custodian had refused them entry because they did not enjoy parliamentary privilege. And the fire chief had been shot at by the Home Guard in the Mall. Churchill wept when he saw the ruins. Luckily for London, Hitler was about to attack Russia, and his bombers were called away to the east. For a while, London could rest and regain her strength. Myra Hess gave midday concerts in the National Gallery. Grey wartime London screwed itself down to the long, hard haul which was to take Britain from avoiding defeat to gaining victory. Hitler's attack on Russia meant we were no longer fighting alone.
May I express my gratitude to all those who contributed to the making of this very excellent machine. The quicker you will send to Russia these good machines, the earlier will come our victory. More thanks.
It was the era of war work and music while you work, tanks for Russia, planes for Berlin, ammunition for the Second Front. The austerity period. Warships week, followed by waste paper month. Smaller rations, but longer queues. The time when it seemed the war would last forever. Heavy bombing was over, and with the great battles raging in Russia, many people thought it would never come back. The government was not so confident. They continued to build deep shelters, properly equipped with light, heat, and water. They were making good some of the earlier deficiencies. The fire brigade, which had fought the Blitz, did drills and maintenance.
It's more difficult to keep going than in the Blitz. Then we could see why we were fighting. Now we couldn't.
They learned how to put out fires according to the book. It was a period of intense frustration. Relearning things you already knew. Preparing for something you didn't think would happen. By 1942, the Americans were in the war, and London seemed like an international barracks, a girl's paradise. Resentful Englishmen summed up the trouble with Americans. Overpaid, overfed, oversexed, and overhere.
Oh, Johnny, how you can love. Oh, Johnny, heaven above. You make my sad heart jump with joy. And when you're near, I just can't sit still a minute. I'm so, oh, Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so? You're not handsome, it's true, but when I look at you, I want to, oh, Johnny, oh.
Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
It was June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. We were back in Europe. Now it could only be a matter of weeks until the end. But then, only 1 week later, on June the 13th, London was back in the front line, facing the grimmest ordeal of all. It was the first of the German secret weapons.
When they sound the last all clear, how happy my darling will be.
With these relatively cheap, pilotless aerial torpedoes, Hitler planned to knock out London and win the war. They were more devastating than anything the city had suffered. Each carried a ton of high explosive. After almost 5 years of war, the enthusiasm and high morale of the Blitz were missing. This new inhuman terror was something that many exhausted Londoners had no longer the resources to meet. In 5 weeks, 1.5 million evacuated, more than twice the number who went in the Great Evacuation of 1939. The defenses were bewildered, and for the civilian there was nothing to do but watch and wait. In mid-July, Duncan Sands, who had been placed in charge of the defense plans, moved all the city's anti-aircraft guns to a narrow belt on the coast between Beachy Head and St. Margaret's Bay. The guns could now pick out their targets as they came in without worrying about their unexploded shells falling on civilians, and fighters could tackle anything that got past the barrage. soon 80% were being destroyed. The fighters had also mastered techniques for shooting them down. Flying at more than 400 miles an hour, the Tempests and Spitfires could only just catch them. And although the Doodlebugs could not fire back, attacking them could be hazardous. On September the 7th, Duncan Sands was able to announce to a relieved city,
"The Battle of London is over."
The day after Duncan Sands' announcement, London was rocked by a huge unexplained explosion. It was Hitler's most destructive weapon, the V-2 rocket. There was no defense against it, and no warning that it was coming. Plans were laid to abandon London.
I was leaving Stratford about 12:25 to finish at Canning Town, and I got to a pub called the Telegraph at the corner of Giff Lane, just past Old West Ham Church. And there was a terrific great crash, a huge cloud of dust, couldn't see much. Now, where those rockets was concerned, they were terrible things, because with the buzz bombs, you could see them, you could hear them. In a certain amount of direction where they were going to go, but with a rocket, it was there. You'd never had a chance. Well, I stopped, I suppose, about 20 yards away from this other bus that was in a bit of a mess. I could see the old conductor sitting on the platform, and I went along, I said, "Hey, Jim," he said, "Leave me alone, Norrie." Well, as far as I can tell you, that poor bloke had got hit right in the lower abdomen with a bit of metal casing. Well, he never did conduct any more buses. He finished up light duty at Upton Park. Well, there was one poor little kid laying on the platform, half in the saloon, half on the platform. Little girl about 10 or 11. And she was opened up just like you see her rabbits opened up in a butcher's shop.
It was the forerunner of today's intercontinental ballistic missile. If Hitler had been able to bring them into use earlier, they might have brought him victory. But the advancing Allied armies overran the launching sites, and the last rocket fell on the 27th of March, 1945, only 5 weeks before the end of the war. Bombs and rockets had killed almost 30,000 Londoners and injured more than 130,000.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end.
It always said we can take it. But it had become a kind of desperate, we can take it. We were tired, oh God, how tired we were. And exhausted.
As long as we keep smiling through, there'll come a day when the clouds roll away and the sun will be shining anew. When they sound the last all clear, the dark, lonely night.